Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and Happy New Year. Thank you for joining us for the Naval War College Foundation's 5th Newport Lecture Series presentation of the 2022 to 2023 academic year, Back to the Future, Deterrence in an Age of Great Power Rivalry. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our monthly speaker series that convenes during the college's academic year and is generously underwritten by the estate of Trustee Emerita Barbara and Mr. Herbert Epstein. I also wish to thank Chairman Bilden, our esteemed board of trustees, members, friends, and sponsors, as well as my staff for their continued support and commitment for the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Enabled and strengthened by our very generous and patriotic foundation members, including many of you, the U.S. Naval War College has continued its innovative, cutting-edge education, research, and scholarship wargaming programs that have sustained it as America's leading institution and standard bearer for professional military education. The Naval War College Foundation is proud to support the U.S. Naval War College and its mission to deliver excellence in education and research and remains steadfast in its commitment to provide the critical resources needed to advance its many priorities, including research and scholarship, curriculum and instruction, endowed chairs, capital improvements, faculty and student academic achievement awards, conferences and symposia, and regional international studies and forum. Tonight's presentation is an example of the scholarly work U.S. Naval War College students are immersed in during their 10-month academic year at the college, whose mission it is to educate and develop future military and civilian leaders of our nation in the world, including many notable flag officers and distinguished civilian executives, such as Admiral Scott Swift, USN retired, former commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and chairman of the Foundation's Strategic Advisory Committee, Admiral Mike Rogers, USN retired, former commander, U.S. Cyber Command and director, National Security Agency, General David Rodriguez, U.S. Army retired, former commander, U.S. Africa Command, Dr. Clifford Stanley, Major General, United States Marine Corps retired, Undersecretary of Defense, Personnel and Readiness, Admiral Robert Papp Jr., U.S. Coast Guard retired, former Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, and of course, Carlos Del Toro, or 78th U.S. Secretary of the Navy. As a matter of practice, should you have questions come to you during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A box versus the chat box, and I'll be happy to present them to our guest speaker during the Q&A session. We plan to address as many of your questions as time permits. Now to introduce and welcome your distinguished guest speaker for tonight's presentation. Dr. Colin Jackson, freshened from 2 weeks in China, is the chair of the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College. He oversees the work of a range of research groups focused on contemporary functional and regional challenges in the maritime domain. These research groups include the China Maritime Studies Institute, the Russia Maritime Studies Institute, the advanced research programs Halsey Alpha, Halsey Bravo, and Holloway, the Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute, and the Brodie Group. In 2022, he was appointed as a commissioner on the Congressional Afghanistan War Commission. Dr. Jackson served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia from 2017 to 2019, and oversaw all strategy, security cooperation, budget oversight, and contingency planning. He also served as the senior DoD representative to the U.S. Taliban peace talks. From 2006 to 2017, he was a professor in the strategy department and later director of the Advanced Strategist program. He also taught courses in strategy and counterinsurgency at MIT in Columbia. In 2011, he deployed in uniform to Afghanistan as executive officer for policy planning, the Deputy Chief of Staff, Operations at U.S. Forces Afghanistan. Before entering academia, he worked in private sector financial, trading, and power development. Dr. Jackson holds degrees from Princeton University, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Colin Jackson. Colin?
Well, thank you, George, and thank you all. The work of the college and its scholars really could not go on in the way that we see it today without the generous support of the foundation, not only in financial support, but philosophical support for what we're up to day in, day out here in research and teaching. So George had asked me to give a talk on sort of where we stand on deterrence broadly construed, It's a topic which I run two risks on. One, that I reduce a very complicated subject to truisms in this kind of time period. And the second risk is that I fall asleep standing up here since I got off the plane at Logan this morning at 7:30. But I'm going to bolster all remaining energy to give you a précis of what's going on in deterrence and why it might matter. So I start with this uplifting introductory slide here, Back to the Future, nuclear mushroom cloud. This is a topic we spent a great deal of time thinking about intensively during the Cold War. And what I'm going to try and argue today is that we sort of took our eye off the ball for a series of understandable reasons during the unipolar moment. And now we're returning with the return of great power competition with China and Russia to looking at these things again. I'm going to walk you through sort of where we've been, where we are, where we might go in deterrence, and then talk a little bit about what we're doing at the college on this topic moving forward. So again, just to see an outline of where I'm going, we'll talk a little bit about deterrence as an idea, as a logical system. Second, deterrence is really a set of ideas emerging primarily from the Cold War and attempts to understand the US-Soviet balance under a nuclear shadow. Third, this idea of, what happened when we were otherwise engaged here from about 1989 through, I'd argue, roughly 2014. And then I'll talk a little bit about where we are on the China and Russia fronts primarily, and then what we're up to at the college. So the argument I'm going to make today is pretty straightforward, that this was an absolute centerpiece, the set of topics during the Cold War. But much of what we knew circa 1989, we have forgotten as a force composed of individuals who were a lot younger than the folks who fought the Cold War. And we have not only forgotten certain things we used to know, there are some things in the contemporary period in terms of instruments and complexities that make this period genuinely new. So we're engaged in a problem of how to relearn things forgotten and also deal with the genuinely novel. I think we'll talk about it as I get farther into this, why this sort of deterrence renaissance or deterrence awakening is sort of critically important and overdue. The picture here is of Bernard Brodie, one of the first major writers on the subject, a man who was a towering figure in civilian academia, focused much of his early work on the Navy. And he emerges in 1946 writing this sort of seminal work, The Absolute Weapon, in which he really reframes how much the world has changed pre and post Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he argues that really the purpose of the military is no longer to win wars, but to avert them. And this is the central concept in nuclear deterrence, the notion that these weapons can be used to prevent the emergence of conflicts on the scale of the First and Second World War. To show that this isn't just an academic argument, Dwight Eisenhower, writing several years later, having lived through this period of enormously frightening competition early in the Cold War, speaks candidly in a private communication and basically says that in the presence of the potential to destroy, for mutual destruction of the United States and the Soviet Union, that essentially the idea of winning wars outright has become problematic. So we juxtapose these two statements, the great scholar, analyst, and one of the towering figures of American leadership in the Cold War. And both of them feel that there was an inflection point with the introduction of nuclear weapons that fundamentally changed what a state was capable of doing. So this idea of deterrence emerged again in the wake of these major developments on the nuclear front. And I'll talk through sort of how this set of ideas works in its generalities. Coercion, which is another term we'll use in this space, was defined as having sort of two forms by Thomas Schelling, another one of the leading authors of the early deterrence literature. He talked about deterrence, trying to convince your adversary not to do something, like to convince the Soviet Union not to invade Western Europe during the Cold War. Compellence is to try to convince your adversary to do something positive, not just to abstain from something, but to do something. So to compel the Soviets to pull back from Eastern Europe. Generally speaking, the understanding was that compellence was harder than deterrence, but both of them were forms of coercion. The simplest way to look at this, and this is one that Lawrence Friedman has used, is to think about deterrence and coercion as the art of using conditional threats to change adversary behavior. So you can think of a series of if-then statements. If you, the Soviet Union, do the following, then I, NATO, and the United States will do X, Y, and Z. And if you do not do that, then I can credibly assure you that I will not punish you for complying with me. So this is the idea of not only making threats, but making them conditional on the behavior of the adversary. The biggest equation at the bottom of this is the notion that an adversary, a rational adversary, may assume that they'll compare two things. What's the cost of defying US demands, and what are the costs of complying with US demands? And ideally, you set up a situation in deterrence where the adversary recognizes that the cost of defying the United States in their attempts to deter or to compel are greater, all things being equal, than the costs of complying with that. So that very, very simple logic then turns out to have a lot of corollaries that are important here. Look, the notion of conditional threats did not begin in 1945, but what makes nuclear weapons interesting is the scale of potential damage you can visit on your adversary. What this means is that threats, because they're of such enormous magnitude in the nuclear world, start to be powerful, powerful tools for blocking things like great power war. This is not a problem without its own challenges. Because they're so terribly costly, adversaries may doubt that you are willing to use the nuclear instrument. And so while it is the ideal weapon for making high magnitude threats, the credibility of those threats is in the eye of the beholder. And there have been many instances in the Cold War and since where adversaries have wondered whether the United States is willing to escalate on a nuclear level over small local stakes. The third major idea here is this distinction between deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. So deterrence by denial is a notion of preventing an adversary from doing something or convincing them not to do it by demonstrating that you can prevent them from doing it if they go forward. Deterrence by denial, say in the contemporary Taiwan case, is trying to convince China that the United States can prevent an invasion of the island of Taiwan. Deterrence by punishment, by contrast, is very different. In that kind of a world, the United States would threaten to visit enormous destruction on the People's Republic of China, and it would be that threat, attacking items of value rather than the notion of preventing them from invading Taiwan, that would check their moves in that direction. So these two schools, how to approach deterrence, is it primarily an issue of demonstrating your ability to deny the enemy what they seek, or is it to just demonstrate to them that you can punish them in large measure? These two schools have long been in tension, and they are in the contemporary period as well. The last piece that's important, logic, the relationship between nuclear weapons and all other instruments, the sort of conventional military instrument and the economic instrument. There's been reams of material written since the 1940s on this. Suffice it to say, this has driven a lot of the policy debates about how to think about defense spending in general, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the Cold War setting. But one of the most powerful ideas to emerge is what's known as the stability-instability paradox. Here, the idea is nuclear weapons may be so frightening to both sides that they prevent episodes like the First and Second World War from occurring. But that very stability may in fact convince those same adversaries that it is safe, quote unquote, to fight peripheral conflicts like Korea, Vietnam, et cetera, because both sides are convinced that their adversary will not go high order because it's potentially self-destructive. So good news, bad news story. Nuclear weapons may dampen the likelihood of enormous wars between great powers, but they may in fact allow peripheral conflicts to continue or expand. Very, very hard to disentangle the logical development of this from the Cold War as a case. And here are the two images on the right, the iconic image of the Berlin crisis of the 1960s, and then below it, the satellite photography of the Cuban Missile Crisis. These two crises were coming at the sort of peak of tensions in the Cold War. We can probably think about the Cold War in nuclear terms in three categories. One, this period of atomic monopoly, where the United States from 45 to 49 and for some time after that had a practical monopoly in nuclear instruments. Then a sort of a race to parity, which was punctuated by the two crises here, and then a late Cold War near parity between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the rise of arms control, the notion that both sides found it so costly to compete in this area that they might want to do mutual reductions. Nuclear deterrence in particular played an important role in adding meat to the bones of George Kennan's notion of containment. If the object of US policy was to contain the Soviet Union in its initial boundaries, including the Warsaw Pact, and put some degree of pressure, deterrence became a very, very interesting complementary idea that the instrument here for containment in large measure was the US atomic arsenal. So again, in the Cold War, several different things emerged. I've talked earlier about what's the relationship between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. How much do you need of each? How do they relate to each other? The large debates of the Cold War really revolved around this theme. Under the Eisenhower era, the notion was under New Look that we would be able to economize on conventional force by maintaining credible large nuclear threats. Various problems in implementing that in actual crises led then to the flexible response doctrine of the Kennedy administration, which said we actually have to have balanced capabilities in the nuclear and conventional realm to respond to a series of different challenges. I think what I would leave you with is that there's this incredible explosion of thinking, very practically minded thinking, both in academic circles and in military circles during the Cold War. But what we see, instead of a convergence of these two groups on generally agreed upon principles, we see important divergences. The man pictured here, Bob Jervis, who just passed away this last year, was an absolute towering figure on the academic side of this argument, in addition to being just a great scholar and a tremendous academic. He wrote a book called The Meaning of the Nuclear Revolution, and he and a series of other scholars suggested that once nuclear parity was reached in the Cold War, that there was rough parity between the Soviet Union and the United States, that the incentives for great power war were almost totally eliminated. So once both sides had a survivable second strike, the ability to absorb a nuclear attack by their opponent and still respond, that beyond that level, there was no real marginal utility to additional investments either in conventional or in nuclear weaponry. So, this was a provocative idea. So the academics as a group seem to be drifting during the Cold War to this notion that we may be overspending both in the conventional and the nuclear realms, and that the wonder of nuclear weapons, horrible though they might be, is that they've removed most of the incentives for great wars of the kind we saw in the 20th century. But what emerges, both in some academic circles and overwhelmingly in military circles, is the notion that many are not comfortable with this nuclear parity argument that Jervis and others are making. Instead, what they see is a notion that we must pursue superiority in various nuclear realms and what is referred to as counterforce capabilities, the ability to attack and target the opponent's nuclear weapons force. Countervalued, by contrast, is the notion of holding his cities at risk, which is really the Nagasaki and Hiroshima model. So the military far from being comforted by mutually assured destruction as a stabilizing force, look for increasing abilities to get after the Soviet arsenal in preemptive ways. And so we see this in submarine technology and tactics. We see it in the development of a mature triad. And what we see is a sort of a divergence between academic and military schools at the end of the Cold War. This would have remained sort of an unresolved dispute over how much is enough, how should we think about the relationship between conventional and nuclear force, had it not been for the end of the Cold War. And really, the end of the Cold War meant that academics primarily remained interested in this, at least on the margins, while the military focused its attention elsewhere. So this unresolved argument really remains only in half, not in full. Academics continue to write prolifically about risks of overinvestment, overspending, instability, inadvertent escalation, these types of topics. And military audiences really shifting to a different set of topics after 1989. So I refer to it here as the age of atrophy. It's not like we burned all the nuclear manuals or Stratcom ceased to be interested in nuclear weapons. That's not what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is that once the Soviet Union had fallen, there were powerful reasons to shift US attention elsewhere. Nuclear weapons became reframed as sort of a hangover from the Cold War period. And I think both sides looked, at least initially, at reducing nuclear stockpiles as a way to reduce costs. And they shifted increasingly to questions of keeping the nuclear club small, keeping people like Iraq, Iran, and North Korea from acquiring these weapons. So what we see is real atrophy in looking at how might nuclear wars be prevented, how might they be waged on a limited level, and instead what we're focused on is hangovers of the Cold War. How do we address remaining nuclear issues, but really ones of sort of zeroing this issue out? And the second one being the explosion of interest in the counterterrorism problem. And in the wars of Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera, I think it's less an issue of resources than it is of attention. And the military force in particular was absorbed for 20 years in a very, very different set of problems. And as a result, lost that muscle memory of how to deal with this set of topics. So when did the big wake up occur? I would argue that the hinge point is somewhere in this sort of 2014 timeframe, 2012 to 2014, when Xi Jinping assumes power in the PRC. And it becomes clear that a longstanding multi-decade US approach to managing China had failed. And that failed approach at the time did not seem crazy. This approach was one of engagement, the notion that including China in the international system, welcoming them into things like the World Trade Organization would lead to economic growth and a mellowing of Chinese communist behavior in the international system. And our theory of victory at the grand strategic level was to go ahead and do this and assume that China would put interests in economic development ahead of geopolitical competition. Xi Jinping really put that to rest pretty rapidly in his tenure by demonstrating, not just talking, that he was interested in territorial issues as well. He speaks a lot about a China dream, both of prosperity and of national rejuvenation. This has been played out in the seizure and militarization of many islands in the South China Sea, and also by a dramatic, really unprecedented military buildup by the PRC with an eye towards potential reconquest of Taiwan. So all these signals start to emerge 2012, 2014 time period up through the present that the Chinese are very serious, that they seek to either displace US hegemony in Asia or more broadly on a global stage. And all of a sudden, it was as if the lights had gone on after a 20-year interest in counterterrorism, that these challenges were real, they weren't going away, and we'd forgotten much of what we knew in the Cold War. Things started to change in the last administration with two things, really. The articulation of a national defense strategy in 2018 that named China and Russia as the chief threats, that announced a return to great power rivalry and competition. These are things that had been talked about, but had never been stated bluntly. And there was a nuclear posture review as well, which was a study looking at what should our policy be on rebuilding the nuclear force that was built essentially in the Cold War. What comes out of that nuclear posture review is a commitment to recapitalize, to rebuild a full nuclear triad. So this involves buying the Columbia SSBN, which will buy 12 of those submarines to replace the current Ohio class for submarine launched ballistic missiles. We're going to rejuvenate our theater nuclear capability with dual use aircraft being able to deliver theater nuclear weapons. We will also field the B-21 Raider, which has been in the news recently, this next generation stealth bomber that will be both conventional and nuclear capable. And also a new ICBM to replace the aging Minuteman III that has been the core of the land-based, silo-based triad leg. So this is what occurs very early in this awakening period. The United States says, well, we have to go back and essentially rebuild what has atrophied in material terms. So this map I'm throwing up here, drawn from The Economist, gives you a sense of the magnitude of the conventional problem that many of us angst about on a daily basis on the research side of the college. So what this shows is a series of range rings. If you look to the far right bottom corner of it, you see these DF-26 and DF-21 ballistic missiles. These are ballistic missiles launched potentially from China. They have anti-ship variants, and they have land attack variants capable of holding at threat almost all US bases in the region, including Guam, as you can see on the map, but all of Japan, all of South Korea, much of the Philippines as well. And these types of capabilities have made it very complicated for the United States to do its traditional game plan, which is to bring force projection capabilities, conventional ones primarily, close into the coast of Asia and project power with things like aircraft carriers and submarines. So the Chinese developments, both on the conventional side, the conventional ballistic missile side, and on other capabilities have made our problem a lot harder in defending allies in the region. So the other shoe dropped about a year ago when, at least in the open literature, this commercial satellite imagery that you're seeing here of the Yumen missile field indicated that the Chinese were also making major moves to expand their nuclear capability. So for many years, the Chinese had maintained something called a minimal deterrent posture. They believed that by having a handful of nuclear weapons that would be targeting probably US cities, that counter value approach, threatening to punish the United States if something occurred in a war, was sufficient from a Chinese point of view. What we started to see was very rapid digging of silo holes in the western deserts of China, which indicated that they were departing dramatically from this minimal deterrent posture and looked like they were building a triad very much like ours, with a submarine component, with a land silo-based component, with mobile missiles, and with air-launched nuclear weapons. What we have seen thus far in the open press indicates that they're going from very, very low numbers of nuclear weapons traditionally up probably into the range. The projections that have been talked about in congressional testimony are upwards of 1,000, maybe 1,500. So a race from the Chinese point of view to match the size of the arsenals of the United States and Russia, which is a big, big deal. This shows you again how commercial satellite imagery, not military imagery, caught elements of this. This is a sort of 4 different stages of them drilling a hole in the ground to build a missile silo out in the western deserts. Again, commercial satellite imagery picked this up and made this a news story outside of intelligence circles in the US military and IC. So what do we think the Chinese are up to with this? It's not clear, and I think there are at least sort of 3 hypotheses which might be at play here, or some mix of all 3. One is that we may be seeking to revitalize our nuclear triad by building a new SSBN submarine, by building new missile silos, by building the B-21 Raider bomber aircraft. And this may be interpreted or misinterpreted by the Chinese as deeply threatening to them. So this may be a case of us moving with, from our point of view, quite reasonable intent, but the adversary may perceive it as a deeply aggressive move, and this leads to a spiral of arms racing. The second notion is that they may simply be looking at what we're doing and saying, if the United States is investing in 3 or 4 different areas, then my best strategy is to make sure I at least match those investments, that I follow the pattern set by the United States in nuclear modernization. Now, the third hypothesis is that this may be by the Chinese to move from minimal deterrence, holding our cities at risk with a small number of weapons, to an attempt to really negate our nuclear advantage from their point of view. That by building a larger nuclear arsenal, they will take away what they perceive as US leverage in a potential war with them that starts on a conventional level. So where have we been going in these discussions? Well, I would argue that the discussions in conventional preparedness on the US side, how ready are we for a potential contingency or a war in Asia, and then how ready are we as a nuclear force, have proceeded in parallel rather than in true harmony. There is loose coherence. There's seriousness on both of these problems that we haven't seen for a very, very long time. But it's not always clear what the prioritization is between these different lines of effort, conventional versus nuclear. Nuclear recapitalization, especially after Chinese breakout, if they're going to move from, low hundreds of nuclear weapons up to true parity at 1,500 warheads with the United States and with Russia, what does that mean? How big of a nuclear force should we have? This is an active and live debate, and it's one in which there aren't absolutely clear answers as to how much is appropriate on the investment side. I would argue that just as much as the decline of our instruments, the decline of our understanding and awareness of how these things work, what the logic is behind them, how adversaries may perceive our signals, this general atrophy in understanding, top to bottom in military and civilian circles, has been pretty alarming to those who have maintained sort of an eternal flame in this space. And so a lot of this is catching up and bringing the force into understanding how do actions I take in the conventional realm have potentially escalatory significance in the nuclear domain. I also hinted to you at the outset, there are some things that are genuinely novel about the period we're living through. So we did not in the Cold War have a major cyber offensive or defensive capability. That's a big, big change. And the question is, what's the relationship between that and nuclear deterrence, nuclear stuff, and also conventional operations? Hypersonic missile capabilities can be nuclear, but are often conventional. We've yet to come up with a sort of a theory of influence for these instruments. Are they like conventional weapons, just much faster? Are they somewhere in this gap between nuclear capabilities on the one hand and traditional conventional capabilities on the other? But again, the thinking on how these instruments might work and how they would fit together is nascent. And the third piece is the sort of evolution of economic sanctions, particularly third-party sanctions, which have become more and more powerful over the last 10, 15 years. And the question for policymakers is, how do they relate to conventional weaponry or to nuclear weaponry? So we have the bad fortune to be living in a laboratory of new deterrence cases. And the Biden administration in the Ukraine is a really, really interesting case. They came into office with the notion of something they called integrated deterrence, the idea that they would use not only nuclear and conventional force, but also economic statecraft, all working together to deter various types of adversary behavior. Not a crazy idea. However, in the lead up to the Ukraine war, you can make the argument, at least, that integrated deterrence in that sense did not work particularly well. In the lead up to the Ukraine war, we made very explicit threats of unspecified economic sanctions, but we also made it very, very clear to the Russians that we would not enter militarily in the case of action in the Ukraine. So that combination of signals, which was a deterrent attempt on the United States' part to deter Russian intervention in Ukraine, in my opinion, failed fundamentally. On the other side, the United States and its NATO allies have had more success in controlling escalation than they have in deterring the initial invasion. In other words, we've heard a lot of nuclear saber rattling by Putin continuously, but we have not seen major escalation from the Russian side, despite all of the rhetoric. And thus far, we would give them, a good grade, I think, on escalation management at this point. What was fascinating was that the case of the Ukraine invasion actually stopped the publication of the Biden administration national security and national defense strategies and their nuclear posture review, and fundamentally altered some elements of both of those documents, because the sort of image they came into office with was upset in many ways by the events in the Ukraine, and that's sort of an ongoing story. I mentioned that I just returned from 2 weeks in Taiwan. This is the #1 deterrence problem in the world, and it's a very practical one. China seeks to reunify what it sees as a rebel province in Taiwan. The United States sees Taiwan as a domestic, democratically ruled polity, and resists the use of force to reunify the two governments. So what do you do if you want to prevent, or not so much prevent, but convince China not to go to military action over Taiwan? The problem is that they have very, very high levels of resolve. You could argue that they care even more about Taiwan than the United States necessarily does about Taiwan in isolation. And they have very, very high capabilities, and they've spent decades acquiring new capabilities, both to negate longstanding US advantages and to demonstrate their particular capabilities. So I just lay out here a series of what one might do to deter Chinese military aggression against Taiwan. So one is to boost one's capability on the Western side, and that has a lot to do with just increasing spending. And again, this is a personal opinion, not one of the Navy or the administration, but I would argue it's very, very strange that we believe we can get away with less than 3% of GDP spent on defense when we're racing a much more vibrant opponent in the People's Republic of China, economically, technologically, than we were with the Soviet Union. At the peak of the Reagan buildup, we were spending 6% of GDP on defense. We're spending less than half that in defense burden terms as a percent of GDP. And I would say that we need to move far up that chain if we're going to be serious about, again, demonstrating to the Chinese that we are serious and that therefore they ought not to go down that road. So I think a powerful signal would be, as Walter Russell Mead has talked about in the last year, an increase in defense spending by another 1% or so of GDP. As an aside, the Japanese have announced a move from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP. Many of the NATO countries are going up by large increments, and we are a conspicuous absent party in that kind of major adjustment. The second would be to demonstrate to China the capability to destroy large numbers of naval targets. Why does this matter? What you're really trying to do is convince them that attempting an invasion of Taiwan would be so costly that they ought not to do it, that it might either fail, that would be deterrence by denial, convincing them that you can prevent them from doing it, and some element of cost imposition. So you want to be able to show you're able to upset their plan in such a way that it's not worth pursuing. Normalizing relations with Taiwan, not on a strict level, not in terms of independence for Taiwan in de jure terms, but just becoming more normal in our actions with Taiwan, I think would signal to the Chinese that this is a very unwise line of reasoning to go down. Yet another line is to strengthen our alliances and partnerships. Here, our relationships with the Republic of Korea, Japanese, the Australians, and the Indians loom very large. Both the political engagement and the military capability and cooperation levels. More controversially, a way to deter China from waging war is to threaten credibly to widen the war. And this is to say, if the People's Republic of China chooses to use force against Taiwan, that the United States would consider it a war not simply over Taiwan, but over a global level. And that's different from threatening to go up vertically in the nuclear domain, but it does signal to China that this would not just be a local incident that's resolved in one way or another. The last two are the ones that are least logical at first glance because they don't appear to have anything to do with China. I would say that the outcome in the Ukraine war may be the most significant contributor to either success or failure in deterrence of China going against Taiwan. In other words, in one scenario, the Ukraine wins pretty decisively and Russia loses in the Ukraine. In that instance, I think that Xi Jinping will think very carefully about whether it's a good idea to go forward on forceful reunification with Taiwan. If, on the other hand, the Ukraine essentially has to accept some sort of Munich settlement, whether because it collapses of its own capabilities or there's pressure from the West to concede or go to negotiated settlement, then I think there is a possibility that Xi Jinping will be emboldened by that. So very much the hinge here may be the way the Ukraine war works out and how that influences the thinking of Xi Jinping and his perspective on Taiwan. What would appear to be the least closely related is this question of the Iranian protests. Why does this matter? The autocracies in the People's Republic of China, the autocracy in Russia, these types of regimes fear above all revolt from within. And what we've been seeing over the last year in terms of protests in Iran against the Iranian regime seem to me to be an area where we could at least be more forward-leaning than we have been thus far, whether in nominal terms or also in material terms. It seems to me any regime change in Iran from below is likely to be an improvement over the regime that we see right now in terms of attitudes towards the region, nuclearization and the like. But critically, China and Russia are watching what is going on in Iran. And if the sense is that the tide is turning against them, they may look inward and not out. All right, so shifting from the narrow Taiwan front, I wanted to talk briefly about sort of what's the major set of issues that are in play right now in the deterrence discussion. If you talk to Admiral Richard, the recently retired commander of STRATCOM, he would argue that we have a three-body problem. In the Cold War, we had two bodies, the Soviet Union and the United States, and it was all about figuring out how to deter one adversary. That bipolar world has now been replaced with what may be very rapidly a three-body world in which roughly equal nuclear capabilities reside in three players: the United States, Russia, and China. We don't have a fully compelling answer as to how to do simultaneous deterrence of two parties, whether in a peacetime situation or in a contingency. If a war broke out in the Pacific, how much nuclear deterrent capability would you need to have both for that conflict and to make sure that other third parties don't enter the war or take advantage of it? And this brings up issues of sizing. How big should the United States arsenal be in this kind of world? How do you avoid arms racing but still have capability sufficient to meet the needs? The other piece of it, there's been debates, and we can talk about this in Q&A if people are interested, on whether or not to have cruise missiles with nuclear capability launched from submarines. Here, the administration and the military have been at odds. But more importantly, this question of nuclear and conventional warfighting and how they work together. Every major conflict, we've seen it in Ukraine, we would see it in Taiwan if that contingency occurred, would be conventional conflicts under the shadow of nuclear weapons. And we haven't seen this in a long, long time. In this respect, a Taiwan contingency, which promises direct conflict between the United States and the PRC, would be even more perilous in certain ways. The Cold War never resolved this question of whether or not limited nuclear war was feasible, whether it could be controlled. or whether it would inevitably spin out of control to strategic nuclear exchange. Similar questions persist in this period of time. I talked about how new capabilities could in certain worlds be stabilizing, cyber instruments, economic sanctions, high conventional capabilities, this kind of thing. But it's also possible that they're destabilizing, that having lots and lots of different instruments in your attempts to deter or to compel an adversary may lead to cascades of misperception. What you think is a stabilizing signal, hey, back off, and if you do, I won't hurt you more, may be seen as dramatic escalation by the adversary and lead to cascades of escalation by the two sides. So does integrated deterrence work? The jury is out. I would argue it didn't in the Ukraine. Maybe it could have with a different bundle of threats and assurances, but it certainly didn't work out the way we would have hoped. This is just the color glossy version of what's going on in the Columbia class in the Navy space. The bottom line here, 12 boats, enormously expensive, and will absorb a large fraction of the US submarine capability, construction capability for the duration of the program. We have no doubt this is going to be a tremendously capable system, but it's a big chunk out of the Navy budget that's going to what is in essence a national mission. All right, I want to leave you with what are we up to at the college in response to this. So when Admiral Richard was commander of STRATCOM, at a certain point about a year and a half ago, he said to a group of us here at the War College, he said, who's going to be the new RAND for this next age of deterrence? If this is a really serious set of problems again, after 20 years of it being kind of sleepy, who's going to do this? The second thing he asked is who's going to educate the next generation of military deterrence experts? And he was clearly pointing at the Naval War College, not to do this in its entirety, but to start to chip away at this in a real way. This coincided with thinking we had been having inside of the Center for Naval Warfare Analysis, the research arm of the college, for a long time. Many of our experts have been worried about the degree of atrophy and understanding in the USG and the military, our lack of insight into how the adversary, particularly the Chinese, think about the use of nuclear weapons, and the sense that, hey, look, we're not going to be an enormous organization that takes all of this on, but can we do boutique work that starts to really contribute to the big questions in this space? What do we think we could do? We've already taken this to heart. We're talking about the early stages of the stand-up of a deterrence program in earnest at the War College. We think that we're going to look at integrated deterrence across a broad spectrum, not just nuclear, but also conventional, high conventional, cyber, economic. But the biggest gap, if I were to identify it, is our understanding of the new nuclear world we're living in. So will it be nuclear only? No. Will it be all of the above? Yes. But the biggest gap is probably in our understanding of this new three-body nuclear world. We held a tremendously successful event, not this past December, but a December ago, where we brought in a bunch of top flight academics, had them interact with senior military leaders on these topics. And we're just getting to the end. We've made 2 offers for 2 young scholars in the deterrence field, which will help amp up the kind of faculty numbers that are applied to this problem. As we move farther forward, what we're hoping is we'll hire probably in the next year and a half, a permanent director for this in the SWORD department, but they'll be overseeing this whole deterrence effort. And we're also going to look at a push on the education side, not just doing top flight research, but how do we get a handful of qualified students G'd up to be that next generation of military deterrence experts. There's a whole bunch of other stuff we may do moving down the road, but this is a bet that not only STRATCOM, not only the Joint Staff, the Navy, but the War College feels very confident in making. I don't think we're going to regret leaning into deterrence studies. It's a big gap. It's an important gap. And we're having a lot of fun in the early steps running down that road. So I went a little longer than I'd wanted to, but I wanted to open up the field to questions, and I'll answer anything I can.
Thank you, Colin, for a thoughtful presentation and informative remarks and continued work and research in this critical mission area. I know it's a lot to ask you to cover in an hour, or actually less than that if we want to have some Q&A time, but you did a very nice job. I just, I wonder within the 10-month program, and I appreciate you looking at, what the Naval War College is, how Naval War College might be tackling this challenge. I mean, you got a 10-month academic program. You focus on policy and law and diplomacy. Is that sufficient amount of time, right, to prepare our mid-grade senior leaders to go out and try to operate and anticipate and strategize in this kind of a complex environment?
Yeah, so I think it's a tough nut to crack on two levels, right? It'd be one thing if we had all the answers and it was just a question of how do we salt this into an existing curriculum. I think it's actually more challenging. You're trying to answer a series of genuine research questions, and how do I get that educationally, either to one of two bodies. One is the full student body, and those are the most challenging things. Having taught for 10 years on the teaching side, curriculum changes at the War College occur slowly. And that's the toughest one to address in a satisfying way. The middle ground is, can we take a small number of students like we do with the Halsey groups and expose them to nuclear topics and allow them to develop a level of expertise that we're doing boutique education of a subset of the population coming through the college, and at least getting them out to the commands in a way that makes general war planners better, and then also potentially Stratcom and some of the other communities better.
Yeah, no doubt. And if I recall correctly, those the Halsey or the advanced research program students are in high demand in each of the COCOMs. So well done on the work that you're doing there. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for questions. As I mentioned earlier, if you've got a question, please submit it via the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. We got about 9 minutes left. So with that said, a couple of questions already in the queue from George Guy Thomas. As we send more and better arms to Ukraine, does this send a message to China that we may not have sufficient arms to help defend Taiwan?
Yeah, so I've heard this argument. I mean, I think the answer is it depends, right? I'm not terribly worried that the kinds of weapons we're providing to Ukraine are going to be missing from stocks that we're going to apply in a Pacific contingency. One, because these aren't fungible capabilities. When people talk about, Ukraine's pounding the table and saying, I need main battle tanks, it's very hard to see an equivalent need or demand signal for main battle tanks in a Taiwan contingency. It's not impossible, but it's not the number one thing people are asking for. So that's the first point. The second point is, China will be watching the outcome of the Ukraine war. We have to do, it seems to me, what we can do to win that war, however defined, and that is slippery, in order to deter Taiwan or China from going against Taiwan, which would be a much more dangerous and destructive episode than what we're seeing in Ukraine. So the fact that these two contingencies are related not only in material terms, but logically in deterrence terms is important. I would be much happier in a world in which, as we're providing weapons to the Ukraine, we're using this as a starting gun to warm up the defense industrial base to produce scales of munitions that are appropriate to the Pacific contingency. I'm currently not thrilled with where we're spending. I don't think we're building enough high-end munitions for the Pacific fight. But I don't think that the arms transfers to Ukraine are the big leak in the system. It's mostly about decades of underinvestment in this space, overinvesting in platforms and underinvesting in munitions.
Yeah, no, thank you. Another follow-up, I guess, from George Guy Thomas. Are you or is the college considering bringing back the global war games of the 1980s? It recommended and recommended contacting Bing West. Obviously, we've had him as a featured guest before.
Yeah, no, this is a live topic of discussion. I mean, that series of games remains in nominal terms, but it's become much more regional in focus. So we tend to look in many of our games at the Pacific in isolation. And I think the questioner is exactly right that there's a case to be made that our thinking has become too regional and ought to be more global, because that's the way the reality of it's going to play out. If a contingency went hot in the Pacific tomorrow, we would be seeing that contingency vividly, but we would also be thinking about Europe and about Russia. And so a return to some level of consideration of how multiple adversaries and multiple theaters fit together might be curative. I mean, the challenge, I know Mike O'Hara, my colleague who runs the wargaming department, would be the first to say, hey, I'm a one-armed paper hanger. I've got twice as many requests for games as I have space to do games. He's working hard with the Navy to try and relieve that constraint. But in the short run, it will be, well, what are we not going to do? And so there are tough wrestling matches between investing additional effort in getting smarter on various forms and facets of the Western Pacific problem versus can I do more notional global games that are not just theater constrained.
Excellent. Thank you. A good question from an anonymous attendee. If your child was studying abroad in Taiwan until July, would you be concerned for their safety?
Well, so I just got back. I mean, it's an interesting question. I wouldn't be concerned per se, but you know, picking timing is an awfully dangerous thing in this. I think the emerging consensus is that we will not have a lot of warning should the Chinese decide to go. There's been speculation by various folks, Admiral Davidson, Admiral Aquilino, General Milley, on timing. People have talked about possibilities of Chinese military action in the next 2 to 5 years. So it's hard to know what to make of this. Coming back from Taiwan, I came away with two impressions that were interesting, one comforting, one not so comforting. At the elite level, I think they are impressed with the seriousness of the Ukraine problem, and they don't want to become the new Ukraine. They don't want to see cities shattered and kind of stuff. And so they're leaning into defense preparations. On the popular level, people I talked to who were expats in Taiwan said, yeah, but the local populace thinks it'll never happen. So there's this peculiar separation between elite opinion, which is increasingly serious, and a question about how serious is popular sentiment about defense preparedness and the kinds of things it would entail. This is going to get played out a little bit in Taiwan's decision to extend conscription from 4 months back to 1 year. And there's a lively debate about how that's going to play out and how the population is going to react. But guessing timing on this one's a tough game. And I think it'd be smarter for us to do some of the things I outlined on the Taiwan deterrence sort of slide in order to avert that, to make sure, and we hear this in a lot of different circles, the name of the game is to convince Xi Jinping every day he wakes up that today's not the day. And that's where all those efforts are focused on his reasoning and his calculus. And if you can make it sufficiently costly or scary to him, maybe you can deter it and in increments extend that timeline out.
Yeah, no, and thank you, Colin. I wanted to remind everybody too, we are recording this presentation. It will be available on our website. So if you wanted to go back and see your slides again, where you outlined some of those recommendations and stuff, that was very helpful. I appreciate you taking the time to do that. Leonard Olson, a nice comment, excellent lecture, very well presented. So thank you, Leonard. George Guy Thomas also appreciated your answer. From John Childs, he asked, how much is nuclear weaponry subject to control, friendly or enemy, by the new cyber world? And he's referencing Admiral Stavridis' 2034 book.
Yeah, so I think what would be safe to say is that there's a lot of thinking going on in this about how not just the cyber domain and the nuclear interact, which is as the questioner points out, each side wants to be incredibly sure that it can command and control in time of crisis its own nuclear weapons. Anything that would diminish that, anything that would threaten that, would diminish the credibility of that nuclear deterrent. So places like Strategic Command are, very, very focused on making sure that their nuclear command and control is intact and that they can maintain it that way. However, the adversary is always trying to chip away at that. And I would add to it not simply the cyber domain, but I think increasingly the likely militarization of space is going to add a wrinkle to this as well. the use of conventional and nuclear weapons and how they relate to space intelligence assets and communications and control assets is going to make this a more complicated game. And again, I think the room for misperception in any party's actions are increasing, not decreasing. And you know, we've seen indications that, you know, things that we think are innocuous to do may be interpreted by the adversary as deeply escalatory and vice versa. And that makes it tough. But yeah, now we are very focused on maintaining NC3 capabilities under strain.
Yeah, no. Well, thank you. There's a couple of more questions in the queue. We'll be able to record them and get back to you. Maybe Colin, we can send them to you via email. Maybe
Sure.
you can answer via email. It's 7 o'clock though now. You just got back from 2 weeks of travel, so we're gonna let you go. It's certainly an honor and a privilege to host you again, and in many respects again. You're a dear friend of the Naval War College Foundation and have repeatedly offered up your time and expertise to present on various national security issues to our members and sponsors and friends. So we appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule to spend it with us this evening. So thank you again.
Well, thank you, George, and thank you to everybody who attended. And I'd be happy to field any questions I can. I think it's an important topic, and happy to take an imperfect swing at it tonight.
It is indeed. I mean, we had a pretty good, I think we topped about 65 attendees today. So it's certainly a keen interest to a topic to discuss. So thanks again. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's lecture. Our next presentation will be on Wednesday, February 22nd, when the Foundation's Chief Financial Officer and Executive Director of Development will host Dr. Paul Schmidt, who will speak about China and some of the looming national security challenges in the region. Updates to this presentation and others can be found on our webpage at nwcfoundation.org/our-events. As always, we seek to expand our membership, individual and corporate, and raise awareness of the great institution, which is the U.S. Naval War College. And we invite you to join us in this charge. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you know of others who may like to learn more about the U.S. Naval War College and Foundation, please consider giving them a tax-deductible gift of membership, so that they too can stay abreast of key issues affecting our national security and democratic way of life. Everything you need to know about joining the Naval War College Foundation or giving a gift of membership can be found on our website under membership. Thank you again for tuning in tonight and for your continued support for the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Have a great rest of your evening. We'll catch you soon. Bye-bye.